Welcome to the Wife of Violence podcast, where we dive deep into topics of personal growth, passion, and leadership, all with violence on our mind. I'm Amber, I'm the wife.
I am Ryan, I am the violence.
And this morning we both woke up and chose violence. On this episode, we will be pulled and pushed in different directions as we embrace the necessity of opposites and explore where they exist in our worlds. So, are you ready for an episode that's black and white and gray all over? He laughed, guys. That's amazing.
You're such a dork.
I can't believe that landed. I'm so happy. All right. I'm going to go with yes, you are.
Okay, perfect.
In episode 3, we spoke briefly about Heraclitus, a Greek philosopher known for his belief in the unity of opposites. Happiness doesn't exist without sadness, being awake doesn't exist without being asleep, and so on. But that just wasn't enough. So I want to dive deeper because at the heart of what we do in the fight space is energy, which consists of the opposite forces, push and pull. I'm going to let you do a lot of the talking in that regards, but for now I'm going to start with 3 push-pull examples that show how interconnected just those two energies are. The first is pushing someone on a swing. The push can continue to take the swinger higher, but only when the pull energy is completed. If you try to push somebody on a swing before gravity has pulled them all the way back to the other side, I think it's rude at that point. You're probably going to knock them off. It's not going to be effective. And then another one is a crowbar, where it's designed to allow you to use a push energy, but creates a pull result. That's just from what I watched of Carl opening a box with a crowbar.
Okay.
I have not successfully done this myself, but the science is there. And then the third is a tire iron, where you use a push and pull together to get the desired effect. No comment on whether I've done that one before either. Or whether I didn't have an appropriate tire iron and just tried to jump on one side and that still wasn't enough because I had no way to pull. So anyway.
I changed the tire for a Domino's pizza delivery driver one time.
Oh, yeah.
Yep. Pizza was late. I was like, where in the world is our pizza? And the guy finally called me and he was like, hey, man, I'm like a mile and a half from your house. And I'm thinking, okay.
you
should
like, be here in time.
I have a flat tire, but I don't know how to change it.
Oh.
So I had 2 cracked ribs at the time. Here I am driving out in the dark to change this poor guy's tire for him just so I could get my pizza.
Man, what a meal you had to work for. So other than changing tires,
yeah.
Uses of push-pull energy in our worlds.
Yeah. I mean, so for those of you that don't know, we are just off of our biggest training event of the year called Hard Ready. It's a 3-day collaborative event where we bring in coaches kind of from all over to teach their brand of violence. Anything from jiu-jitsu to wrestling, Krav Maga, Muay Thai, Balintawak. We've had kind of exposure to a little bit of everything over time. And I would say one of the most common themes, if not the most common theme, across all the coaches, even with very disparate backgrounds, was this idea of push and pull and the energies that are requisite in a fighting context. Somebody can exert energy on me by pushing me, or they can pull me, and you could say, well, a punch is a push or whatever. And I think that was a pretty common thread with everybody, no matter what kind of system or program or art they were teaching, because it just is. There are only so many ways that someone can try to injure me, hurt me, and they all are either pushing or pulling in some way. And the idea that I'm going to use a push or a pull to break somebody's posture and then break their balance to get them moving in a direction that gets them out of control.
Yeah.
Is kind of the idea, which then leads to, whatever the next thing is.
In a strange combination of worlds, one of the places we saw that this weekend was in Icy Mike's segment. He's got the Hard to Hurt channel. Listeners/viewers may know of him.
I've never heard of it.
You guys look nothing alike. You're really not even similar at all, so that's the good news.
Well, he looks like my older brother from what I understand.
I heard the same. So in one of his segments throughout the 2-hour session, one of the options was to pull away from somebody punching, which is a push energy to make them miss, and then you capitalize on them over committing to that energy.
Yep. In that example, the more you can get someone to commit, the easier it is to manipulate them.
One of my favorite relationship advices. Oh, no, fighting advice. Wait, what?
Yeah. But again, you saw it throughout. Danny referenced it. Aaron Janetti referenced it. I certainly referenced it. You probably did. It's just one of those things that's sort of universal if you really understand fighting and you understand violence and you understand how to manipulate someone else physically, not emotionally.
In my segment, we looked at a takedown, which I proceeded with what I called mostly a takedown. And that wasn't any kind of soft talk. It really was just mostly a takedown. And maybe if I'm big and strong and I snap somebody down forward, I get them to the ground. But I was ready for them to fight me trying to pull them. And as they pulled away, then pushing to put them on the ground in a different direction.
Yeah.
And especially being a smaller person, typically the smaller person in the room, typically the smaller fighter, I need to rely on them helping me a little bit.
Yeah.
And so I need one energy so that I can use that for my others.
Right. And it's not you guessing the energy. It's you, again, manipulating, Jedi mind tricking them into giving you the energy that you are then going to anticipate and then take advantage of it. Because again, it's the one time where, use your partner's size or strength against them or whatever. That's not wholly factual, but it's not also completely wrong. There's something to it. It's just not as simple as, well, if they're big and strong, then I can use that against them. No, I have to be intentional about my approach to doing that. And then it still might fail. It's not a catch-all.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a way for me to hopefully game the system a little bit.
We've circled right back around to the Friends reference where Pete Decker goes in the ring and he was taught how to use his opponent's size and weight against him. And Ross goes, well, that guy is in serious trouble.
Yes.
It's not that simple. Well, so you mentioned me being ready for that other energy to come. And there's an intellectual knowledge that comes from that, or just a physical, tactile sense of knowledge from that. And we see it just makes sense that for one thing to occur, the other thing is going to happen. Something that makes you really happy isn't always just forever and ever and ever and ever and ever and ever going to make you really happy. At some point, there's the other side of it. Success doesn't mean your success forever and ever and ever and ever. At some point, there's failure on the other side, especially if you get comfortable. This worked. I'm good. Let's go. Because everything is in flux. Everything is constantly changing.
Yeah.
And that pulls us back to what Heraclitus said about no man steps in a river twice. He's not the same man. It's not the same river.
Yeah. Well, the reality is success doesn't exist without failure. Failure doesn't exist without success. There's no dark without light. It's the yin and yang. You can't have the masculine without the feminine. And you can get very in the weeds and very philosophical about the whole thing, but the reality is one must exist in order for the other to exist. It's funny, when you first brought this topic up, the thing that immediately came to mind to me, because right now I'm in the process of working on another logo for a new project of ours. And so the idea of color theory came to mind for me. And I haven't taken an art class in a really long time, so I may butcher this a little bit.
But, never for me, so you won't hear any pushback here.
So I think Isaac Newton invented the color wheel, and on the color wheel, you have this spectrum of colors, and the colors that are on the exact opposite of each other are the complementary colors. The interesting thing to me about that is, one, when you think complementary, you think, well, these things enhance each other, they work together. They serve to make the other better. On the color wheel, they're exact opposites, right? And if you combine those colors, they cancel each other out. So if you combine blue and orange, for example, you're going to get some form of a gray, black-ish color.
This podcast is colorful and yet still gray all over. Interesting. Okay. No, but I actually didn't know that. I mean, I understand the color wheel and using colors together on opposite sides, but I didn't know that's what happens when you combine them.
Yeah. So if you think about it like push and pull, if I have equal amount of push and equal amount of pull, they negate each other. They're gonna cancel each other out.
That's cars going the same speed hit head on in a crash and they stop.
Yeah. Yeah. And so anyway, when you brought this up, that's because I'm right in the middle of this, logo project. That's immediately the thing that came to mind for me was complementary colors and how the terminology complementary is interesting when they are exact opposites on the color wheel, but then they also serve to cancel each other out when they are combined in equal doses.
I wish I had that in my notes. I would have never thought to look that up. That's amazing. I'm so glad you know that. I hope it's real. No one Google that. That is real in my head.
I could have just totally made that up. I didn't make it up. I could be wrong though. But that doesn't sound right. So we're just gonna go with it.
Sounds good. So sticking with the hard ready theme, one of the ideas that I had already explored for this podcast, but I ended up being happy that we filmed it after Hard Ready, was working with Grandmaster Bobby Tawada in Balintawak Arnis, because he can swing that stick so fast with such force or velocity. I'm not 100% sure which is the right one right now. It has yes. You know it has power, but you have to relax to swing it that fast. You can't just muscle through. So there's this very fast balance between relaxing and tensing to have power with speed.
Yeah. And again, you see carryovers in most athletic endeavors with that. Bobby never referenced, I don't think, push-pull energy. But it was all over the place in his seminar.
Yeah.
If you look at the way he uses his body and the way that his hips and shoulders on one side lead that push, but his hips and shoulders on the other side lead that pull, and you get those kind of antagonistic movements and motions. He has such a nuanced way of creating speed and power. Obviously, there's some pretty intricate footwork that happens in Balintawak that Bobby was certain to confuse us all with.
Yes.
No, I think everybody did really well considering that was mostly new to most people.
Yeah.
But if you watch the way he moves, his body is getting out before his stick is getting out. And it's serving to drive all that energy, all that speed, all that power through. And he talked about the sound of the stick and where the sound is in motion, and where it needed to be in order to be truly effective with the power of the strike.
Everything coming from the ground as you're driving and turning through, creating that. It's push pull. It's also looked at as torque, where one side's going forward, one side's going back, similar to if you're opening a jar, you're pulling and pushing to make it work.
Or spinning a top, anything like that.
And if we go back to the idea of that car crash, two cars, same speed, perfectly head on, they stop. Two cars, same speed, misaligned. You almost increase power because you create that spin, that torque. And it can almost multiply. And we see that too. We saw that with Daniel Chacon's session, where he was looking at extension and contraction to send strong, powerful knees.
Yeah. Well, and it existed in Aaron's session too, where he talked about extension and contraction,
posts and frames,
posts, and being able to control somebody's posture in that way, which is just, again, push pull.
Yeah.
I extend, I push, I contract, I pull, and it's weightlifting. It's the same. If I'm going to get strong in one plane, one modality, it's going to be pushing motions. If I'm going to get strong in another, it's going to be pulling motions. Those are the energies that we are most commonly going to see in everyday life. The ones that are going to be most relative to most people.
Right.
And they are contradictory. The duality there is what makes them what they are. Even if you look at the Fit to Fight logo, the circle is formed by two sort of abstract Fs.
Yep. Have you noticed that?
with with the complementary colors of orange and blue.
That we now know combined to cancel each other out. I'm so excited. Keep going.
But it's meant to be reminiscent of the yin yang symbol.
Yeah.
Which again, you have in yin yang, you have the black and the white. Well, if you put those two together, which when you start getting into black and white, now you're going to get a little bit more. One is an absence of color. I don't want to get far versus, but we add those two things together, and we're going to get gray.
Yeah.
In equal parts at least.
Mm-hmm.
But if we had more or lesser one, we're still going to get gray. It's just going to be a different shade of gray.
Right.
Which is where life tends to mostly exist.
There's pushes and pulls. There's happiness. There's sadness. There's awake. There's asleep. And you really can't stay at one end of the spectrum.
No.
If you can ever get to 100%, you definitely can't stay there long. I'd argue, and Carl Jung would argue, you can't really stay at that far end of the spectrum.
Yeah, no, I think it's exhausting. On either end, it's exhausting. That's why, for the most part, extremes when it comes to life, they are moments in time. If we try to push, if we try to redline all the time, sooner or later something's going to give. Something's going to give out. We need to be able to downshift to keep moving in some form or fashion and not wreck everything internally that we have.
So, quick story about that. I had a Fitbit for about 2 days where I wore it and I did all the things.
Yeah.
And I really like numbers, and I'm definitely very competitive when it's self versus self. Other things, I won't get into the weeds. Anyway, self versus self for sure, competitive. And so I knew immediately, I was like, oh, this is going to be to a detriment. And, the first day I got to whatever steps or however it's counted. And then the next day I was like, cool, I have to beat this. And it didn't take me long to be like, oh, this is really unsustainable. I'm going to get upset when I start dropping, because you can't just keep beating what you've done. It has an upper limit. And maybe you can, but at some point that cookie is going to crumble.
Yes.
One of my favorite references from this podcast, by the way. I used it all weekend.
That's why in lifting you have deload weeks, right? You program in a week where I am going to back off.
We do? Yeah, no, I understand. Those weeks get programmed for us. They're called the week before Hard Ready.
Yes. Because again, physically, mentally, emotionally, there are upper limits. You can continue to push those things, but not all the time. There needs to be a scale back. There needs to be a coming down off of those extreme limits in order to recharge, re-energize, maybe refocus, reframe, whatever it is. Make sure that this upper limit that I'm continuing to push is still matching whatever my initial goals were that I set for myself.
Right.
Because it's easy to get blinded by, and we've kind of touched on this a little bit before, it's easy to get blinded by this thing that I set to attain. And I'm pushing for it, and I'm pushing for it, and I'm pushing for it. And if I don't ever slow down and kind of take an accounting of where I am, what else is going on around me, is this still the direction I need to be going in? And is it still the smartest, safest way for me to be going in this direction?
Oh, that for sure. We talked about that. So in taking that idea and putting it into the structure of the world around us, we look at bridges. If we just kept trying to make a bridge collapse, so we tried to make it stronger, and something happened, we tried to make it stronger. We just tried to make it stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger. Our society would not be where it is today. Because at some point we realized bridges, yes, they need to be durable, but they also need to have some flex.
Yeah. Skyscrapers, same thing. They've got to be able to move a little bit. If you look at, we just had a major storm, come through, Hurricane Helene. And if you look at a lot of the trees that got either broken or knocked down, they were the biggest,
big, sturdy,
heaviest, harder woods, because something eventually has to give. And if you look at like a lot of either the smaller trees, the younger trees, the softer trees, they tend to survive that just a little bit better because they kind of, for a lack of a better term, go with the flow.
They sway through the storm.
Yeah, there's an understanding of when I need to resist and push back, and when I need to release and kind of go with it. And that goes back to fighting as well.
And it also goes into seatbelts, which, sorry, I'm trying to stay in the structure. Seatbelts tighten on impact.
There's a structure?
No. Actually, we're doing, okay, so I'm going to remember my spot.
You have a spot?
If you can tell, I'm more of the type A, organized, structured kind of person. Ryan's here going with the flow. He's probably not getting knocked down in storms. I'm falling over, getting thrown every which way. It is what it is. We stay a couple episodes ahead on this podcast, and I loved that. And then life hit, and we had a lot of busy weeks. We had a hurricane, we had Hard Ready, and a bunch of other things within that. And so we are filming this dangerously close to the deadline for me, nowhere near the deadline for Ryan. And there's a little bit of tension in me. However, I love that we're doing this after Hard Ready. Because that first section that we looked at was so important, and it's really cool. One, we get to shout out our friends and these really important people around us who are doing great things, and tie it together into this world for us for this podcast.
Yeah, for sure. And we haven't mentioned Chris Magno or Eli Knight yet, so I'm going to go ahead and throw them out there because they were also coaches involved in the weekend that put on amazing segments. And Chris Magno is not on social media, but Eli Knight definitely is. And if you know us, you follow us, you already know Eli. But they both put on fantastic segments as well,
with lots of push-pull, lots of force.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, shooting. Look at shooting.
Oh yeah, an incredible management of push and pull, and knowing when to stay rigid, knowing when to relax, knowing where.
If you're going to manage that recoil at all, there's going to be a massive amount of knowing when to push, when to pull, and when to put the two together.
Wild.
Because the push and pull there, you're trying to
manage
neutralize
an explosion in your hand. Yeah.
So the right amount of push, the right amount of pull, they negate each other, and you get very little muzzle flip, right?
Right. Yeah. Very little movement. You're able to keep your sights on target much easier. Man, it feels a little disappointing going back to seatbelts. Oh well. So, leave us comments, message us, get on social media, interact. If you want a whole section on gun mechanics,
we will bring in Chris Magno.
We will bring in Chris Magno, of course.
It won't be us.
So seatbelts tighten on impact to tie you to the speed of the car, but then they loosen a bit to slow your deceleration down so you don't stop as hard as the car stops. And the airbags do that too. I mean, a lot of people think of it as a cushion, but it's the same idea. They want to slow you down, but they don't want to slow you down too fast, too hard.
Yeah. Well, if you look at, and we talk about this in our classes, what causes a concussion? Well, I force the skull to move really, really fast, and the brain happens to do the same. But because the brain is sitting in fluid inside the skull, when the skull stops, the brain doesn't. And so the brain crashes into the skull at the same speed, which is what causes the bruising of the brain and the concussive effect. So I guess seatbelts are designed to help kind of minimize that same effect to the body, which I actually didn't know that. I mean, it makes perfect sense. If I had given it some thought, I probably would have maybe come up with it. I don't know, but I definitely didn't know it.
I went down such a rabbit hole of YouTube car crash things. It was a little disappointing, but otherwise, the seatbelt and airbag tests came up, and I was like, oh, that makes sense. That's what that's doing. So we moved from fight life into structure of society and back again. I'm going to move more into personalities.
Okay.
And that's going to be introversion versus extroversion, which I already plugged Carl Jung a little bit, and he coined the terms extroversion and introversion in the 1920s, and also believed that no one is 100% one or the other. We carry traits, but tend to lean to one side or another. And so I requested Ryan do a personality test. Not because I was I aced
it, by the way.
Just knocked it out of the park. We do both identify as introverts.
Yeah.
There is a different side to our extroversion. And for me, a lot of that really came forward during COVID when we were in the lockdowns. Because for me, most every day when I teach, I go in, I teach 3-ish hours, and I feel good. I'm happy being in front of a room, interacting, doing all these things. And then sometimes I drive home in silence.
Yeah.
I I'm done. Like, I'm good to go. I'm all set, not talking to anyone, not even hearing music sometimes. And when we were in COVID, teaching to a screen projected on a wall,
Ugh.
I know, with no one else really in the room, just a couple of us, we'd get done teaching for about the same amount of time. And I'd be like, oh, I want to go out. I want to do something. And of course, I couldn't do any of that. But it was
Right.
weird feeling that energy after an evening of work and having that energy.
Yeah.
And that's where I realized, oh, I have this extroversion energy. It's just a lot of it goes into what I do in the evenings.
I think you have a lot more of that than I do.
Yes, agree.
Yeah, I'm very selective.
Selectively social.
Yes. Yes. Very. Yeah, but yeah, it is interesting that teaching to a laptop or whatever was not the same. The energy that you get from people, you don't really realize it, I think,
Yeah.
until you don't have it.
Right.
The energy that you get from people being actually in the room is an important piece of what we do, I think. And I found it very draining teaching to a screen.
Yeah. Interesting. When you got done teaching,
I was exhausted.
you were exhausted.
Yeah. I had I think it sounds like maybe almost the opposite kind of reaction that you did. I didn't want to do anything. I was just done.
You needed people.
No. I mean, yes, but I then
Yeah.
didn't want to go seek people out.
Seek people out.
Like,
because you were selective. This is where you extrovert.
Yeah.
It's not here for me. I'm not going to go look to replace it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's interesting. So introversion is important. And again, most people are on both sides. They have an introverted side, they have an extroverted side, and yet extroversion seems to be more encouraged growing up than introversion. This is an idea that Susan Cain references in her book Quiet, The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking. Where she was talking about a summer camp experience she had where she was going to summer camp her first time and she packed a bunch of books because in her family, quiet time together was how they spent their time and they read together and that was bonding and that was part of her. And yet she almost got in trouble and humiliated at camp for wanting to have this time to herself and read. And she pictured being in a cabin with a bunch of other girls and sitting there reading. And that's not what they look for. And I see this when I go do class talks in schools. Sometimes there are rows of desks, but a lot of times it's 4 or 5 grouped together. And for me, I was just thinking, I was like, oh my gosh, that's my nightmares. If I walked into a classroom at school and it was a bunch of desks grouped together and I was going to be forced to work with these people, I'm pretty sure you can relate on that.
Oh yeah, that's terrible.
I'm like, let me just do it on my own, please. And I get, obviously, we have to be able to work together
Sure.
and there's a balance to that. But really, extroversion seems to be so much more encouraged. And introversion almost looked at like there might be a problem with this person.
Yes. Well, I mean, you're immediately termed antisocial.
Yes. Yeah.
Which I think, I mean, obviously can be a thing, but I think it's much less likely that somebody is antisocial versus just being selectively introverted.
I like that. I like that. I think the world needs to know that more. We're going to work on getting that word out there. All right. One other avenue, maybe one, who knows? It's like, well, listen, I'm a fitness coach. One more time doesn't mean anything. No. So one more thing.
Yeah. 30 seconds.
In terms of
half later.
It's fine. It's my 30 seconds, That's not right. Your 30 seconds. So teaching kids, being in charge of kids, having your own kids that you're managing. This idea of picking your battles is a play between dualities. Sometimes I let them get a little out of hand, and then sometimes I bring them into order. But if you try to just have order the entire time, you're going to go crazy. The kid's going to go crazy. It's going to be a disaster. If you try to just let them be out of hand the whole time, obviously we can see the end of that one. We have to have that balance.
Yeah. Again, it goes back to extremes.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I don't think as humans we are built to sustain long-term places in extremes. You know, super hard discipline, for example, versus absolutely no discipline. You see it in kids where no matter what people seem to think, kids want some semblance of structure, some semblance of they wouldn't call
Tell
it
you.
discipline, and they wouldn't,
Yeah.
you know, and they wouldn't even probably know it, like in a way that they could express it. But some semblance of that is important, but it's also their kids.
Yeah.
And if you're going to try to treat them as adults and make them conform as adults, that's also going to manifest in very poor behaviors. I think, you know, we've seen a proliferation in the past decade, 2 decades, whatever, of a lot of kids being medicated in schools. And I'm not saying there's not a time and place for it. But sometimes a 6-year-old boy is just being a 6-year-old boy.
Right.
He's not acting out, or, you know, he's not hyperactive or whatever. He's just a 6-year-old boy.
Yeah.
And a 6-year-old boy is not built to sit at a desk for, and I'm saying boy, girl, whatever. 6 hours a day, 7 hours a day, whatever it is. I can't do that.
No.
I'm 50, and if I had to sit at a desk all day, it would be very, very bad for anyone in my vicinity, because I'm just not built that way. And as an adult, I probably should be able to make myself do that. But to think that a 6-year-old can or should is, to me, makes no sense. And so, as a good teacher, a good coach, whatever, you have to find a way to have a little bit more orange or a little bit more blue, and not just go all orange or all blue and
force them all to be one way or the other.
Right.
Well, and that's
the easy, lazy way to do it. That's not teaching. That's not coaching. I have to understand that everybody in my space learns a little bit differently. They have a bit of a different background. They have a different social, whatever it is. Different intelligence levels. I mean, that's just the truth.
It matters.
And so to think that I'm going to be able to teach them all exactly the same. Now, I'm not saying, look, I get it. Teachers, you know, they're.
Oh, this is not a dig on teachers at all.
No.
And the school system, by and large, does a pretty tough job of allowing teachers to find that creative space.
It's set up all wrong. Like it's just not conducive to the best way of teaching kids. It's just not. And that's a whole other topic. But the idea of we're going to make all kids be this way or that way, again, life is mostly in the gray. And if we're all push all day long, something's going to give. If we're all pull all day long, something's going to give. One must exist in order for the other one to exist, and in order for us to prosper,
move forward. You mentioned something, and it made me think about how you approach nutrition. It's not follow this by the letter, and, you know, granted, there are things out there where you are following by the letter, but generally, if you are the average person who's just trying to feel better, live a healthier life, the rule I believe you use is 85% as a judgment, as a guideline. If you're getting 85% of your meals in this course,
if you're eating relatively clean 85% of the time, that other 15-20%, have at it. Because if you tell yourself that you have to eat 100% clean all day, every day, the only thing you're going to think about is the things that you cannot have, is the things that you've told your body are not good for you or bad for you or whatever. Look, I think we get one life. I think. And I think it could end at any second. And I think we should do what we can within reason to enjoy it. You know, I don't obviously our enjoyment stops at someone else's detriment. But otherwise, I think life should be lived in a way that we at least seek out being happy and enjoying it. And if I'm not enjoying eating, for example, I don't think it's a long-term sustainable way to go about it. That's why you see people go on these hard, heavy discipline crash diets, and maybe they lose a lot of weight on the front end, but then they gain it all back, and sometimes even more, because it's not long-term sustainable. That hard line, that all push, you just can't do it forever.
Yeah, it makes me think of a pendulum. You go all the way hard to one side, that swing is coming back hard.
Yeah.
Where you won't find a center. Balance isn't a thing. It's just trying to change these oscillations to be smaller and smaller. So the pendulum swings a little bit less, and the other side of that isn't as bad.
Yeah. We're seeking to moderate that push and pull as much as we can, just understanding that sometimes we don't have control over it. We just have to control the things that we can. And when you're talking about nutrition, for example, that's something we control, for the most part. I mean, obviously there may be socioeconomic things that keep us from eating certain ways in some situations. But for the most part, one of the most basic things that we do control is our food, our intake, what we consume. And so if we can look at it, I think, in a healthier way, and for me, healthier is not these extremes. It is finding some semblance of a compromise. Again, not balance. It's going to be, if we stay to the duality of push pull, it's going to be 80% push and 20% pull, or whatever. But again, if it's all push, sooner or later we're going to hit that wall, and that snap back, that pull is gonna. It's like being at the end of a bungee cord and just running, and sooner or later you run out of that cord, and that snapback's going to hurt.
Absolutely. So obviously there's a ton of dualities that we didn't necessarily touch on within this. I have in my notes music versus silence, or sound versus silence. You don't have a lot of compositions where it's just sound the entire time or just silence the entire time. Although there is one. Maybe I'll post it on our Instagram. So everybody go to Instagram, interact, so I can put more things up there. But also let us know other dualities that exist in your life, in your job, maybe in your sports, where you see these dualities happen and how necessary they are for both. That's your homework. I'm not going to call it homework. I knew you were going to groan at that. No, but we'd love to see where you're making these connections in life. So please comment on Spotify. I know you can, on YouTube. Interact with us on social media. We're on Twitter and Instagram. Just reach out so that we can keep providing you more content. And we have a pretty awesome announcement coming in the next episode. So make sure that you like and I hope so. We'll see. Maybe. It depends. There it is.
There it is.
So make sure you're subscribed. You can set up automatic downloads on Spotify. You can get notifications on YouTube and Spotify as well to get all of these announcements and have things just ready when you're available to listen to them. So make sure you're doing all of those things. I am going to end with a quote, because it's just one of my favorite things. Change is the very nature of nature. If there's one thing that doesn't change, it is the fact that everything changes. That's from Ilchi Lee on Change, Realizing Your Greatest Potential.
Okay.
Yeah. The only constant is change itself, kind of thing.
Yep.
All right.
Got it.
Glad you understand now. It took this podcast, right? That's our look at embracing duality, the power of opposites. If you didn't enjoy this podcast, just keep it to yourself. Stay off of social media and go on with your life as usual. If you did enjoy this discussion, please, 5-star reviews help us so much. They go a long way. Follow, share, subscribe, and join the conversation on social media. Thanks for listening to Wife of Violence, and we look forward to growing with you next time.
Thanks, everybody.